Along Russia's border with Ukraine, the troops are pulling back. Today, Russia said it is withdrawing its forces, which have been massing near the border with Ukraine for the past 2 weeks. The announcement came from Russia's defense minister as he was observing military maneuvers in Crimea today. Russia has been holding massive drills in and around the territory that it annexed from Ukraine back in 2014. Troops have also gathered in Russia close to areas of eastern Ukraine currently held by pro-Russian separatists. So what was Russia trying to do by moving so many of its forces near Ukraine? The defense minister said it was all an exercise to show that Russian troops are always ready to respond.
I consider the goals of the snap check of readiness fulfilled. The troops have shown their defense capability, and I decided to complete the drills in the southern and western military districts. General staff, heads of military districts and airborne forces must start the return of troops to the points of permanent location from April the 23rd.
Well, those exercises have drawn criticism from NATO and Western governments, which have described them as a provocation. They've also led to a rise in tensions in Ukraine. DW's Ukraine correspondent Nick Connolly has been to the city of Mariupol, close to the Russian border. The people there have been preparing for the worst.
Only a few of the older children here can really remember a time without war. Since conflict began 7 years ago, these children have seen parents lose their livelihoods and often their lives. Now they've found stability in this Christian children's home in Mariupol, a city of 500,000 people just a matter of kilometers from the front lines. Dropping everything and getting to safety in a hurry is what this drill is all about. Russia's troop buildup along Ukraine's borders means these kinds of exercises are once again part of daily life here. For some of the teenagers, though, there's little need to practice.
Back in 2014, I spent 2 months living in our cellar with my mum. I never thought the war would reach us. I remember watching TV. It all just seemed so unreal, like something from a film. Then our neighbour's house was hit. We ran down into the cellar for cover, and we were just listening to it all. It was really scary. I was scared the house would collapse around us and we'd be trapped down there.
Back in 2014, Mariupol's frontline suburbs saw the shelling of residential neighbourhoods and dozens of casualties. Nowadays, the front line is still just as close to the city and its residents just as vulnerable. Ukraine's army has made significant strides since 2014, but at sea, where Russian forces are also now massing, Ukraine is still at a significant disadvantage. The crew of this Ukrainian Coast Guard vessel are tight-lipped. All they're willing to tell us is that they've seen increased Russian activity in recent weeks. They're ready and willing, they say, to respond to any possible provocation. Whether or not they expect all-out war, they refuse to say.
Behind me is a ship belonging to Russia's FSB security service, and it's anchored just half an hour's journey off the Ukrainian shore. Ukraine's handful of Coast Guard vessels are hopelessly outnumbered in these waters, and with Russia controlling access to this sea, the Sea of Azov, neither Ukraine nor its allies can send any reinforcements.
For all the military and diplomatic posturing, everyday life here in Mariupol goes on, and can often seem oblivious to all the attention being paid to this region by the outside world.
I have no idea if there will be a war or not, but it definitely doesn't depend on what we do here.
Yes, they're raising tensions now, but I still think this is all about political bargaining.
Everyone here in Mariupol has a suitcase packed with money and essentials in case they need to leave in a hurry. Everyone does.
We're tired of being afraid. That's something people here in eastern Ukraine tell you time and time again. Desperate for a chance to live a little. Even if that won't stop them preparing for the worst as they, like the rest of the world, try to understand what it is Vladimir Putin and his troops have in store for them.
Well, my first guest tonight is Kurt Volker. He was U.S. Special Representative for Ukraine between 2017 and 2019 under former U.S. President Trump. He took part in negotiations involving Russia to secure a ceasefire in the breakaway regions of eastern Ukraine. Ambassador, it's good to see you again. It's good to have you on the program again. How would you answer those people in our report from Mariupol? What is Vladimir Putin's end game with Ukraine?
Well, I think I don't mean to attack the question, but it's a misunderstanding to think that Putin thinks in terms of end games. Putin thinks in terms of position. How does he amass power and influence, and how does he apply that over time opportunistically without any end in sight? And I think what he's done with the accumulation of military force here is to demonstrate that he has substantial military capability and the political will to act if he wants to. And he's trying to demonstrate on the opposite side that the West is not willing to use force and is not willing to match that, and therefore Ukraine had better watch out.
So what do you make then of Russia's announcement that it will pull back its troops? Is Putin finished this time, beating his chest?
I think we have to really think hard about what pulling back the troops means. Mm-hmm. What the defense minister said is to their points of permanent location. It's not clear that those are the same places they came from. He may be moving them to new permanent locations. We'll find out. Secondly, some of the things that he's done, such as declare parts of the Black Sea and parts of the Sea of Azov off limits to foreign vessels. Those are meant to continue through October. We'll see what happens even after that, but that's actually a long commitment. He's also, as part of this deployment, put new types of forces into the Crimean Peninsula, paratroopers, amphibious landing vehicles. He's moved things from the Caspian and Siberia to the Rostov region of Russia. We'll see what actually departs. We'll see what he leaves there. We'll see what change in capabilities there is as a result of this going forward. One of the things that was in your report was the suggestion that this has a political motive in terms of negotiations or posture in addition to military. And I think that's exactly right. I think what he is trying to do is to demonstrate that the Minsk agreements from Russia's perspective have not produced what they wanted, which is an independent portion of Ukraine that prevents Ukraine from becoming part of the West, from developing economically and so forth. And so he may be looking at new political steps that will follow on from this military deployment. You can imagine, for instance, recognizing as independent the two so-called People's Republics, Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republics, that Russia set up inside Ukraine. You could imagine some announcement this weekend about a closer union with Belarus, or maybe even unifying the Russian and Belarusian armed forces, which would create a new northern front for Ukraine. So I think there's a lot yet that we haven't seen that we may still see.
And I'm wondering, Ambassador, is there a subtext here to the message that Putin is trying to send? Is he trying to tell us that Ukraine will never be allowed to join NATO, for example?
Well, he's certainly declaring that that is his intent, that he does not want Ukraine to be a successful democracy. I think that's the most important thing, because if Ukraine is a successful democracy and prosperous country, why isn't Russia? So the first thing is to block Ukraine. Part of that is blocking Ukraine from European Union. If you remember, the Maidan in 2014 had nothing to do with NATO. It was about Yanukovych's desire to prevent Ukraine from signing an association agreement with the EU, which brought people out into the streets. And it was the fact that Yanukovych fired upon the people and then fled the country that caused Putin to then want to overturn the situation in Crimea, to invade there, to invade in the east. And then finally, yes, I think NATO is a part of it, but it's a secondary or third objective in that.
We were struck that Russia has said that the Ukrainian president, Mr. Zelenskyy, is welcome at any time in Moscow for talks. Should President Zelenskyy, should he take up President Putin on that offer?
Well, let's get the sequencing here right. President Zelenskyy proposed to President Putin that he would go to Moscow to talk about peace in the Donbass. Putin responded that he'd love to see Zelenskyy anytime, but not to talk about the Donbass. Mm-hmm. Putin says that this is an internal Ukrainian issue and that Zelenskyy needs to talk to the so-called separatists. This is a device that Russia is using to misportray, to create disinformation and make it appear that there's an internal Ukrainian conflict with separatists who spontaneously decided to fight against the Ukrainian government. That is a false narrative. Russia invaded Ukraine, created the separatists, arms them, trains them, equips them, controls and handpicks the civilian administrations there as well, and then is trying to force Zelensky to deal with them as if Russia has nothing to do with the problem. So his refusal to meet with Zelensky about the Donbass is really the significant part of that statement.
You say that Putin is using this false narrative. President Biden also says that. He's now in the White House. What should the Biden administration do on the Ukraine issue?
Well, the most important things that we need to be doing, and it's not only the United States, it's Germany, it's NATO, it's the EU, we need to be taking action to demonstrate our capabilities and our resolve. So, for example, we're going to be conducting a military exercise in Poland next week anyway on a long scheduled basis. Let's involve Ukraine in that exercise somehow to show that we are willing to try to work with Ukraine. We have security assistance that we provide to Ukraine. The Biden administration is looking at accelerating some of that assistance, which is a good idea. The United States has not had an ambassador in Ukraine for 2 years or a special envoy for Ukraine for a year and a half. I think putting some names out there and getting people on the ground quickly would be another positive step. We could be announcing in advance what sanctions we would apply if Russia were to launch a new military offensive. We haven't made those kind of statements yet. There are a lot of things we could be putting on the table to warn Putin about what the consequences of his actions could be.
Ambassador, I've got about 45 seconds. If Putin gets his way, he could be in power in Russia until the year 2036. There could be 3 more U.S. presidents between now and then. I mean, he definitely wins in continuity and the ability to plan accordingly, or do you see it differently?
Well, I see him stuck. I don't see how he can leave power and stay alive. And so I think that he is looking for a way to preserve his hold on power financially and through the power ministries and the application of force inside Russia. But another aspect of this story is the Navalny situation. Putin would not normally imprison an opponent and arrest 11,000 protesters. He's done it in this case, which demonstrates that he's clearly concerned about his domestic position.
Okay, former U.S. Special Representative for Ukraine, Ambassador Kurt Volker. Ambassador, it's good to have you on the program. We appreciate your time and your insights tonight. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
All right, let's bring in our correspondent, Nicholas Connolly. He is in Kiev. Good evening to you. Nicholas, what's the reaction been to the news that these troops and these forces are going to pull back?
Good evening, Brent. Well, obviously a lot of relief here in Kiev tonight. We've seen the markets react already. Ukraine's currency, the hryvnia, strengthening against the euro and other currencies against that news of the end of that direct threat to military action by Russia. But I think people in Ukraine have a lot of good reason to stay worried, and until they see hard and fast evidence of that tech and personnel being drawn away from Ukraine's frontiers by Russia, I think people will still be exceedingly nervous. There have been speculations today that Russia may leave some hardware, some missile systems close to the border as a kind of open threat. We've seen talk today of closer military integration between Russia and Belarus. Belarus has a long border with Ukraine, so plenty of levers there for Russia to continue putting pressure on Ukraine.
We heard today that the Russian president says he wants to host the Ukrainian president for talks in Moscow. What do you make of that? I mean, is that a sign of de-escalation?
As so often with Vladimir Putin, I think this is less than it seems at first. He said that Zelensky can come to Moscow at any time to discuss, quote, bilateral issues, which he said would not include Donbass. As has been the case for the last 7 years, Russia claims that this is an internal issue between Kiev and those separatist regions. He said Zelensky should go talk to those separatist leaders first, which he knows full well Zelensky can politically never do. That is not going to happen. And he's just continued this Russian line that doesn't get more convincing with the time that Russia is not involved in this conflict. We know well that Russian citizens, former, quote, former Russian security agents were at the very heart of that separatist insurgency in 2014. Those regions are financially dependent on Russia, and Russia has now handed out over 500,000 passports there. Soon, everyone there wanting one will get a Russian passport. So basically, by saying what he did today, he's basically saying to Zelensky, you are not on my level. I'm going to talk to Biden. If you want to come crawling to Moscow and ask for some kind of engagement, you can try, but I'm not going to give you any kind of signs of de-escalation.
Well, speaking of the U.S. president, did Western criticism from the U.S., from the European Union, from NATO, do you think that influenced the Kremlin's decision today?
Well, Vladimir Putin makes a point of demonstratively behaving in such a way as to suggest that outside pressure, be it from protesters on the streets of Russia or foreign countries, cannot influence his behavior. I think that's also why the West was relatively quiet in terms of elucidating sanctions or other responses to Russia had it put any troops here on the ground in Ukraine. All those threats were kept to the diplomatic back channels. I think Western support for Ukraine has been pretty strong and pretty unanimous. I think that will have impressed Moscow. But also, in a short-term sense, he got what he wanted. I think the roots of all this are that interview with Biden, in which Biden agreed with the interviewer and said that Vladimir Putin is a killer. That really hurt. Vladimir Putin is happy to be cast as a kind of scary, big-time opponent of the West. What he does want to be treated, though, is as an equal. And by calling him a killer, I think there was a worry in Moscow that Russia would be diplomatically isolated and treated as beyond the pale. And by setting up this troop movements, he now has a summit on the cards this summer with Biden. So in the short term, he's got what he wanted.
Yeah, that's a very good point to make there. Nicholas Connolly with the latest tonight in Kiev. Nick, thank you.